Hello everyone and welcome to our Thursday webinar. I'm Jonno, Proudfoot, and this is the Real Meal Revolution online programs webinar with our special guests, our weekly guests, Professor Noakes. Welcome again, Prof.
Thanks, Jonno.
And before we get started, I just wanted to remind you that we now have 180 certified Bantam coaches who are trained to help guide you through our program. So if you'd like to understand a little bit more about LCHF and have someone support you on your weight loss journey, please check out realmealrevolution.com, click on the homepage on Find a Coach, and go and find a coach in your area or in your country to help you lose weight. I think we're in about 10 countries at the moment, spread out between Australasia, Africa, Europe, the United Kingdom. I mentioned those separately this week, and North America. And if you'd like to find out more about what Prof's up to, go check out the noakesfoundation.org. Prof, what is the Noakes Foundation doing at the moment?
Well, we are in discussions to try to raise more money so we can do more research. I think that's the key, we've got our research projects already going on people who reverse their diabetes, and we're studying liver glucose production in them, which has not been done before as far as I know. And so that's exciting work. It's expensive and we always need money. So that's Jane Bullen, who is our chairperson runs our programs, has just been back from San Diego, the low carb conference. She spoke there about the interventions that we have in our poor communities in South Africa and how effective they've been. And she had a standing ovation at the end, because no one has applied the low carb diet to the poor people. And the results are astonishing, because they have the worst diet, and that's where they can benefit the most. So we're very excited, and we're following up some leads there. But it's often about raising the money to allow us to continue to expand the story. And we had people from Cuba and Mexico want to get involved because they have the same sort of problems.
So if you'd like to get involved, donate some money or somehow get involved in running a project with the Noakes Foundation, pop over to the noakesfoundation.org. Either bang them off an email from the contact page, or if you just like to donate, you can click on the donate now button. Okay, we're going to get straight into our questions. The first question is from Janice, and she says, "Hi there, I have a question or problem. I'm suffering from bad breath since I have been banting. Why?"
I think that's actually right. I think it's ketones. And a lovely little story there. The first time I got involved in low carbohydrate diets was when I was running marathons in the 1970s. And we used to, for 3 days, we would eat no carbohydrates. And then we really struggled to run. It's really interesting. We couldn't run. And then for 3 days before the race, we'd load up on carbs. So there was the depletion loading phase. And by and large, it seemed to work very well. And during those phases of the low carbs, then I'd get ketotic and my wife would tell me about bad breath. And that led to our first study of post-exercise ketosis, which was published in the Journal of Physiology in 1980. And no one knew at the time what were the factors determining post-exercise ketosis. And so we showed that if you starved people of carbohydrates and then made them exercise, they got this massive ketosis. And we then showed that it was almost certainly because the liver had run out of glycogen or carbohydrates. And that seemed to be the driver. It might also be because the muscles have run out of glycogen or the starch in the muscles. But that produces the ketones, and that gives you a slightly strange smell to your breath. So yes, that's what's happened. And unfortunately, it is a feature of the diet. By and large, I think as you do the diet more and more, your ketosis goes down and your bad breath tends to disappear after a few years. But unfortunately, you may have a few years learning to cope with this problem.
If I could just add to that, sure. You get bad breath for a number of different reasons. And the ketotic breath, like Prof said, is a very specific ammonia sort of aroma. It smells almost chemical. So if your partner is complaining about that kind of breath, and that's the breath that surrounds you, even if you're speaking to someone not even directly, you can just smell it sort of radiating off them. That is the ketotic breath. If it's standard sort of foul breath, that usually comes from you could have a very dry mouth, or from not eating often enough. Usually when you eat you sort of rinse your mouth food that you're actually eating, and your bad breath goes away. So if you have ketotic ammonia type breath, it's very difficult to cure. But if you have foul breath, sometimes just a glass of water and an extra brush can do the trick. So our next question is from Helen Perry. And Helen says, "Dear Prof and Jonno, I'm writing from Brisbane, Australia, where my husband David and I have lived for many years after leaving SA in 1994. We work as a psychologist and a medical doctor, respectively. I love the webcast every week and so glad that Prof is back in circulation after the diabolical trial. Since when is medical registration board the arbitrator of science? But onwards we go. After dieting constantly and unsuccessfully for over 30 years, I've now been living the Banting lifestyle for about 3 years, having moved from 81.6 to 56 kilograms. Like remarkable weight loss. I'm now told that I look years younger than I did. Last year, on a visit to South Africa, my husband, who you taught at medical school, Prof, read The Real Meal Revolution and finally began the journey too. He's lost 10 kilograms, mostly from his trunk. My weight loss has been a major health benefit, as I'm 55 and 152 centimeters tall, and I have a 25-year-old artificial hip. I could hardly exercise because of the pain and many musculoskeletal problems due to, well, anyone's guess. As I have had so many varying opinions over the last years, septic arthritis, osteoarthritis, Perth disease, Skirman's disease, dish and fibromyalgia, etc. I now walk regularly and do Pilates twice a week, and despite ongoing pain issues, I look fitter and feel healthier than I have in 30 years. As a bonus, I recently discovered that I can fit into my old brownies and primary school uniforms. Very funny. My first question relates to my health, and the second one is from my husband. What influence do you think a ketogenic diet plays on bone and muscle health in general? And do you have any comment on whether dairy and carb intake are important in managing the sorts of difficulties I have vaguely described? I tend to eat and drink a moderate amount of dairy, as I've always felt it was important for my bone health.
My impression is that osteoporosis wasn't a problem before we started eating the industrial diet. So the industrial problem, in my view. And in other words, it's a high carbohydrate, high refined diet. And once you cut those foods and eat lots of nutritious foods, real foods, you should prevent the risk of osteoporosis. If you look at the bones of humans before the agricultural revolution, they appear to be much stronger, and we were taller. And along came the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago, and we became shorter. And to me, that indicates that we weren't getting decent bone strength and bone health. So I would think that if we look at it carefully, it is the high carbohydrate, high refined diet that causes osteoporosis, and eating a real diet, real foods, will prevent osteoporosis. I'm not sure that you can reverse osteoporosis once it's developed, but if you are eating this diet, you're not going to get any worse. Of course, as you know, because your husband's a doctor, our treatment for osteoporosis is to take calcium and medication. And if you look at the results, I think they're pretty putrid. So I think that we must look for other ways. And, one good measure is tooth health. Your teeth are terribly unhealthy on cereals, low vitamin D intake, and lots of grains. That's what kills teeth. You're never told that. You're told it's an absence of flossing and whatever. But it's not. It's a lack of vitamin D from fat-soluble vitamins, and it's too much cereals, and then added sugar. But studies in the 1930s showed if you want strong teeth, you've got to avoid those. You've got to have lots of vitamin D in fat-soluble vitamins coming from proper foods, and you mustn't eat cereals. And so if it's the teeth expressing that, what about the rest of the body? So I think the evidence will be that it's the diet we've been eating, industrial diet, that causes osteoporosis.
Cool. And the next question is, after an episode of calcium oxalate uric calculi, what is your opinion on whether a ketogenic diet is advisable, and if so, are there any modifications necessary?
Yeah, I don't know that we know whether renal stones are caused by this diet or not. It's very unlikely because most renal stones occur in people eating a traditional industrial diet. So I would think that if we're going to get rid of kidney stones, it's probably this diet that's going to do it. It's certainly not the industrial diet. So we've got no reason why you shouldn't go on the Banting diet. We've got every reason why you shouldn't be on the traditional diet if we're talking about kidney stones, because kidney stones occur in people eating the traditional diet. So there's no reason to suspect why, if you change your diet completely, is that going to cause kidney stones. It's very likely it's the opposite.
Cool. And she says, thanks again for being one of the forerunners. And she hopes to be on the Banting.
Good luck.
Okay, next is from Jean in Cape Town. I don't know if it's Jean or Jean, but Jean or Jean says, hi, Prof and Jonno. I want to know whether the HbA1c blood test can be used to see whether you are in ketosis. If so, what would the appropriate reading be?
No, the HbA1c just tells you how insulin resistant and pre-diabetic, diabetic you are. So let's briefly go through it because it's so important. There was a paper out this week that everyone should be screened for cholesterol from the age of 8 onwards. I mean, it's unbelievable. Whereas if we were looking at everyone for their insulin resistance from the age of 8, we'd make a real difference. It's astonishing. 65% of Americans over 65 have type 2 diabetes or profound insulin resistance. They don't all have heart attacks. So let's focus on what we should be doing. So the HbA1c is a measure of how insulin resistant you are and what is your carbohydrate intake. 6.5 is a terrible value. That means you have diabetes, and higher is just even worse. Value is 5 is good, and below 5 is even better, but between 5 and 6.5 is where most of us fit. And you want to be, so we want you to get you down from 6.5 to 5.5. If we could keep everyone between 5 and 5.5, we'd have no diabetes, because diabetes starts at 6 or 6.5. And the point is that with age, you just move across the spectrum from 5 to 6.5. That may take 30 years. So the HbA1c tells you how close you are getting towards having a diagnosis of diabetes. The higher the value, the closer you are to having diabetes. That's why we measure that. Ketosis is an acute effect. HbA1c measures a chronic change over time, whereas ketosis is an acute effect. You can go into ketosis within 24 hours of cutting all carbohydrates from the diet. And we use a monitor, one of the blood monitors, so when we take our glucose, we can also measure ketones. And that's how we measure ketosis. You can check your urine with keto sticks, but they're not really that accurate. You really want to know what's in your blood. So they're very accurate measures for blood ketones. It's a simple prick on the finger, blood sample onto a machine that you can have for yourself. The problem is the ketone strips cost a lot. They're probably 50 Rand a test. So that's quite an expensive test, yeah.
And then the next question is, what blood tests? Oh, okay, sorry. So we've got there. I was asked by the Path Lab whether I wanted a serum one or another one, which I can't remember the name of. So you were saying the blood test that measure ketones.
Yeah.
So there's two. There's a cheap one and an expensive one.
Yeah. If you went, I'm not sure. Probably if you go through the laboratories, they'll take it from blood. So you'll have your blood measured, a venous sample, and they'll send it off, and they could measure your ketones on that. It's probably cheaper in the long term to buy one of these little glucose ketone monitors, and then to buy 50 strips, and then you can measure ketones regularly, and that's the best way to do it.
Something else about ketones. So you said, something that you said was acute and chronic. And just for those of you who are mere mortals like myself, acute means like very short term.
Yeah.
And chronic means a long term. Is it useful having a long term or a blood test at the doctor for something like ketones? Because your ketones can spike and drop during the day.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And do you know the breathalyzer ketone test?
Yes.
There's a thing called a Ketonex in South Africa, and I think there are quite a few elsewhere in the world.
That's correct. It doesn't give you a number as far as I know. It just gives you, are you in ketosis or not?
Oh, okay.
And so that's, if you really want to measure it, you need to measure the only way is really to use a finger prick.
Okay, great. Okay, our next question is from Shahab, and Shahab says, I have a few questions regarding the energy use and ATP regeneration. Do you think fat would be a good fuel for sports that demand high energy bursts and get the ATP regeneration primarily from ATP/CP and glycolytic pathways? I'm talking about sports like powerlifting and weightlifting. where you should regenerate ATP between sets?
Yeah, Shahib, you ask a question that is critical to all of our understanding. And generally it's said that the diet, the Banting diet, is no good for explosive sports because you cut down your ability to produce ATP from carbohydrates, and the ATP from fats is never produced at a fast enough rate. So if that is true, then we would see that people could not lift weights and they couldn't improve their performance in sprints. And any event where you have to suddenly increase your speed would be detrimentally affected by these diets. And so that's the traditional view. The traditional view is that if we start exercising, let's say at 50% of our maximum, and we go up to 100% of our maximum, somewhere around here at about 70 to 80%, you run out, you can't burn fat anymore, and you have to burn carbohydrates. So in other words, from 85 to 100% of your maximum capacity, you have to burn carbohydrates. Now, the only problem with that is that we can't measure fat metabolism indirectly from measuring your oxygen that you're exhaling and your carbon dioxide once you start to exercise too vigorously. And all this idea that you stop burning fat and you burn carbohydrates as the intensity rises is from studies of humans where we measure the expired air. And we're realizing that actually there's something masking how much fat you're actually using. And it was really interesting. Paul Larson and some colleagues in New Zealand published a paper last year where they took a group of sprinters who were either very good or not so good. And they measured how much fat they were using. And they used different methods. And they found out that the best sprinters, when they were sprinting maximally, were using 3 times as much fat as the poor sprinters. And they said, we've missed something. It's clear that you can burn fat at high intensity exercise. And I think that that's the reality, that you do burn fat when you're exercising at high intensity. We just can't measure it for various reasons. However, if you speak to athletes and they're the final deciders about this thing, you definitely get some athletes who will tell you that they lose their top gear when they are on this diet. But I'm not convinced that it's purely because of something that's changing in the muscles. I think there's a brain component to it, because the brain ultimately determines how vigorously you exercise. And there may well be some adaptations in the brain with chronic adaptation to this diet, and that's what makes you lose your high level of performance. One of the problems we have as physiologists is we make an observation, and then we say, well, obviously this is why that happened. And then we reduce it to a simple explanation. And so it's ATP generation, but ATP generation in the muscle is not what determines how fast you run. What determines how fast you run is the mass of muscle that you can recruit or activate. And I had this long argument on Twitter recently about Chris Froome. You see, so Chris Froome is clearly on the Banting diet for his stable diet. And then he eats more carbohydrates on the days he races or does high intensity training, and he takes carbohydrate near the end of the stages. But he's principally a fat burning human being who adds the carbohydrates. And so the question was asked, how does Chris Froome speed up during a time trial? By the way, he was a bronze medalist yesterday, really exciting, in the Olympics. How does he speed up in a time trial? And the answer is, if we were to take a muscle sample of him, we would find that 80% of his muscles are the fat glucose burning fibers, and only 20% are the sprint fibers. Now, if he was only using his sprint fibers, which are dependent on glycogen or starch to produce ATP, if he was only able to use those fibers when he was sprinting near the end of the Tour de France, he could only go 20% of his maximum speed because only using 20% of the fibers. So when he's sprinting, he's using a large number of fibers, which are aerobic fat-burning fibers. And he's also burning these fibers that are sugar-burning fibers or glycogen-burning fibers. You don't switch from the one fiber to the next. You just add in. And as he goes faster, he adds in more of the fast contracting fibers. He doesn't drop out the fibers that he was originally using. And the physiologists haven't resolved that question. And the answer is that a guy like Chris Froome must have fibers that can burn fat at a high rate, and they can provide enough energy when he's sprinting to keep him wanting to use those fibers. So it's a complex thing. And what I find really interesting is go and watch CrossFit athletes and watch them. And some of those athletes are the most astonishing performers. And they're all eating this high-fat diet, yet they're very explosive. So the last story has not been written. And my opinion is that those people who lose their top gear when they go on this diet, they do it because there's a brain change in some way. And acutely taking carbohydrate can overcome that problem. It doesn't reverse what's going on in the muscles, but somehow it tells the brain it's okay, you can recruit more fibers, you can go faster. So that's my theory at the moment.
Cool. And then the next question is, why is canola oil on the red list when it is mostly monounsaturated fat? Dr. Finney doesn't seem to have a problem with canola oil.
Yeah, canola oil wasn't around in the 1970s even. It's a new product and it's highly processed. And so although it has omega-3s, it's completely unproven. We don't know what else is included in that food stuff. So it's a fake food, and that's why we don't promote it, I suspect. And the other point to make is never cook in vegetable oils, because even if it's omega-3s, they turn into, when you cook with them, they turn into cancer-producing chemicals. And it's really interesting because I was attacked vigorously. Sorry, our book was attacked vigorously by scientists in South Africa recently because they looked at canola oil and a couple of other oils and said they're all healthy because they don't have trans fats in them. And most of the ones that they looked at are omega-6s. And the paper then was sent for discussions. We sent it to the guy who spoke about the cancer-causing agents when you cook with vegetable oils. And he wrote the scathing report. He said, how can you say that vegetable oils are safe to cook in or to use when you don't report that they have these, that when you use them, they produce these cancer-producing agents? So I see no benefit in canola oil. It's a new product. It's highly processed. We don't know what it contains. There are no long-term studies. It's not something that's been in our diets for any more than 20 or 30 years. And so that's the reason that Jonno's probably got other reasons as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the process, obviously, they're not particularly real. But my only gripe is that when they go rancid more quickly, they're unstable, and also when you heat them, they become bad fats. So best to stay away. You want to eat foods that don't denature when you cook with them. And saturated fats, animal fats, and coconut oil in particular have a very high smoking point. And as soon as an oil smokes, that's an indication that it's been broken down and denatured. And what you'll find is saturated fat can go well over 200 degrees before it smokes. Butter is the only curveball because it's actually got butter solids in it, and that's why you can only get normal butter to a certain temperature. But if you take clarified butter, in other words, you've skimmed all the fat off the butter solids, you can get it twice as high before it starts smoking. So yes, saturated fats, much tougher to break, and remember that saturated fats are generally in their natural form. They haven't gone through a 50-step refining process. And then the final question from Shahab is, why does it say in the course that caffeine halts weight loss? Isn't it the opposite? So I'd like to add if you have one. Caffeine is a curveball. I mean, coffee, let me start again. The term studies have shown is probably the most controversial opener that you'll ever read. And studies have shown that carbs make you fat. Studies have shown that carbs make you thin. Studies have shown without food for a month. There are loads of studies, and the studies that we refer to vary. But as far as caffeine goes, there are two schools of thought. The one is that caffeine increases your metabolism and then makes you burn calories faster. There are also studies that show that caffeine can make you more alert and increase your IQ. My original final question there would be, what happens when you peak and trough mentally all the time? Surely you would retain information longer if you stayed constant. And how do you then stay constant? But the reason we say caffeine halts weight loss is because if you are on a buzz constantly, it puts your body in a state of stress. And what they have seen in some studies is that constant consumption of caffeine actually raises the cortisol levels in your blood, and cortisol is the stress hormone. And the stress hormone is one of the biggest hindrances on weight loss. So, you know, a lot of people will band absolutely perfectly and still not lose weight. And then as soon as they take the stress away, you know, by socializing, exercising, spending more time relaxing, they actually start to lose weight. And even if you're doing all that, but you're drinking sort of 6-8 cups of coffee a day, you might not lose weight. And that's purely because of the stress that your body's under. The same thing happens with endurance exercise. A lot of people think that endurance exercise can hinder weight loss. And that's because endurance exercise, as opposed to short burst, high intensity exercise, actually puts your body in a state of stress, which I'm sure you'll probably end up looking at in your fat runner study.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Anything else to add about coffee?
Very happy about that. Yeah.
And the final reason is that a lot of people drink cappuccinos all day. and over and above the stress that the caffeine might put you into, a cappuccino has got about 120 mils of milk. And if you look at the carb count on milk, you could be looking at 15 grams of carbs per 100 mils. So if you've had, you know, 5 cappuccinos in a day, that's 600 mils of milk, which is 6 times 15, 90 grams of carbs, way over the threshold before you even had a stick of broccoli. So if you do feel like toning down on coffee, it wouldn't be a bad idea, I believe. Okay, next question comes from Natalie. And Natalie says, hello, Prof. I've been banting for almost a year and I've lost nearly 40 pounds.
Fantastic.
I just received results from my latest blood test. The lipids are all good, which is better than a year ago, but my blood sugar was not good. I fasted before the test, either 11 or 12 or 13 hours, but my fasting glucose was 6.3, which indicates prediabetes. And the hemoglobin A1C was 6.4, which again indicates prediabetes. My question is, if one is banting and then fasts for 12 or more hours, does the body not get the glucose it requires from metabolizing fat stored within the body? If this is true, then 6.3 would be well within the range of a healthy blood sugar. Or am I on the wrong track and not properly understanding the process of ketosis?
So Natalie, congratulations, because you've made the diagnosis in yourself, and it doesn't say how old you are, but you've saved yourself from developing type 2 diabetes and from suffering all the consequences. And it's a great pity that more people don't go through the testing that you went through. So you, in fact, are diabetic. I'm diabetic, so it's not a diagnosis of death. The beauty of having diabetes is that you've got a chronic disease and you'll live forever if you learn how to manage it. The worst thing for you would have been what happened to me, that we only made the diagnosis too late. But you made it just early enough and you could reverse. It's possible that you could reverse. So your point is that your fasting glucose is way out of the normal range at 6.3. It should be 5. That tells me that your liver is overproducing glucose and the glucose is struggling to get taken up by the tissues. And so you have to oversecrete insulin. So you're hyperinsulinemic, you're insulin resistant. And your liver just pumps out the glucose and it can't be controlled. And that's why your glucose is elevated. The actual mechanism is really interesting because, we don't know whether it's the liver that's driving the problem or it's the resistance of the muscles to taking up the glucose that actually drives the problem. But anyway, the point is your liver's producing too much glucose and it's got to reduce. Your HbA1c is also 6.4 is a diagnosis, in my view, of type 2 diabetes. We would say 6.5 is a diagnosis, but 6.4 is essentially the same. Recall that the normal value goes from 5 to 6.5, and then we say you've got diabetes. Well, 6.4 is the same as 6.5. So I would make a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, and I would put you on metformin, and I would do lots of exercise, and I would do plenty of fasting, and see if you can improve your glucose control even further. Probably an HbA1c of 6.4, if you were to live the rest of your life with that, you'd probably be fine, but the evidence seems to be that get it under 6, get it down to 5.8, 5.7 is probably slightly better for you. And you should be able to do that with a low-carb diet, lots of exercise, and using a drug like metformin. But I wouldn't not do something, because the probability is that if you keep your glucose high, it will cause slightly more damage with time, and then you will eventually require more medication. So rather act now early and prevent further progression of the condition.
Just an insert little disclaimer, that is a scientist providing information, and not a patient-doctor relationship. And and we still highly recommend you see your doctor.
Right.
Okay, before Prof lands up in court again. Is there anything else you wanted to add in there, Prof?
No, I think that's that's a really interesting point, because I'm giving you standard medical advice on that one. It's not as if I'm telling you to go and do something that will kill you. That there's no question the advice I gave you there is absolutely standard. And in fact, if you weren't given that advice, the person who said, "Oh, it's fine, wait till your HbA1c is 6.5," that's negligent advice. Yeah. So I quite agree with Jonno giving the disclaimer, but the reality is I'm on trial for giving advice which they consider unconventional. The advice I've given you there is dead conventional. And the only reason we don't give it out is because medicine wants customers, it doesn't want cures. I want to cure you of your diabetes. I want to make sure that you don't get worse. Unfortunately, my profession will say, HbA1c is 6.4, you don't have diabetes, it may disappear dramatically, so we won't bother. And that's wrong, because you're going to get to 6.5 and 7. And then you'll require insulin, and that's the worst thing. You do not want to use insulin for the management of your diabetes. So I'm trying to cure you, not turn you into a customer for the pharmaceutical industry to make money out of you in the future.
There we go. Okay, and this is one long question from Colleen. And this is our last question for the day. She says, I've been doing LCHF for 3 months and I've lost 3.3 kilos. I weigh 75 and I'm 5.2 inches. 5'2", not hugely obese, but with up to 20 kilos to lose. Funny thing is, I do not look fat. People are always surprised to find out how heavy I am. I guess I have slim legs and big belly, which I dress to hide, and I get away with it. I have a history of high cholesterol, with low HDL and high LDL and bad ratios. I've been diagnosed with type 2, but I have kept my HbA1c and glucose well under control by not eating grains or sugar for some years now. Okay, I have fatty liver and I've had an ultrasound recently. Yesterday I saw my GP after having fasting bloods taken to check on everything. She knew I was an LCHF and was really hoping it was going to work for me. She does not know much about it at all. Only what I told her that in that consultation some months back when I started. Yesterday she was really worried about me. I was prepared for this to some extent. I was not going to freak out over elevated overall numbers, but I did hope to see some improvement in my HDL going up, my trigs going down, and my LDL going down too. What happened was the reverse, except for my HDL, which in my opinion has gone up slightly from 0.71 to 0.86. My trigs have gone from 2.3 to 2.9. LDL has gone from 2 to 6.4, which had her very worried. And my cholesterol HDL ratio is now 10 as a result. My trig HDL ratio is 2.6. Last night I watched a video, someone recommending Prof Ken in Melbourne when to worry. He said that 5% of LCHF people get these very high LDLs. He said they should go on statins. He went on to explain the possible reason for this, but he did not say how it could be fixed or that the diet would work for this. My doctor has told me that I have a 25 to 30% risk of vascular event in the next 5 years. I'm high risk. It's like having a cancer diagnosis. She pointed out that the only change in my life during the past 3 months has been the inclusion of saturated fats. Yes, I lost a little bit of weight, but at what cost was her statement. My liver function tests were really bad, worse than last time. And yeah, some results that say that it was bad. So she said she'd love to hear what you think.
So Colleen, firstly, I want to discuss the issue of risk and what the doctor means. So what does he mean by your risk of heart attack increased 25%? So what if I told you that your risk probably increased 100%? Would you now say, gosh, that's even worse? Well, it depends what your basic risk is. Let's say if you have a risk of 1 in 1,000 of having a heart attack in the rest of your life, and we increase it 100%, it goes from 1 in 1,000 to 2 in 1,000. Would you worry about that? Of course not. So the point is that it's not the percentage risk that goes up. It depends what's your baseline risk. And you're a female, and females are at low risk of heart disease. I'm not sure you mentioned your age, but so you're already at low risk. So even if your risk goes up 100%, it's a trivial increase. And that's what the doctors don't understand themselves. You have to ask him, doctor, what's my baseline risk? Is it 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, 1 in 2? If it's 1 in 2 and your risk goes up 100%, then you're going to get a 100% chance of having a heart attack. So then it means something, but if it's 1 in 1,000, it's meaningless. So just saying your risk has gone up 25% is utterly, completely meaningless. So that's the first point. Secondly, you do show a response that about 5 or 10% of patients show. The majority of people, cholesterol goes up a little bit, or it goes down, or it stays the same, obviously. But in long-term studies, most people, their cholesterol actually goes down on this diet. What worries me is your triglycerides have gone up, and that's very unusual. And you've got a fatty liver, and you should not have a fatty liver on this diet. The treatment for fatty liver is a high-fat diet. So there's something wrong in your metabolism that we can't explain at the moment. My concern is that you've got worse on the diet. As a doctor, to suggest you should continue on the diet, because to me the triglycerides are the real issue, because they are, if they go up, that tells me that your liver is just under stress, and as it shows, you've got this fatty liver condition. So I think you are one of those unique individuals who we don't know how to treat you, and it's clear that your response has been not healthy to this diet. The problem is, if you go back on a high carbohydrate diet, you may also show bad changes. Your liver might become slightly better, but you might become more insulin resistant, and your glucose goes out of control. So it's a real dilemma for us, and we don't have the answers. And I think just going on to a statin, I'm not sure that that's the solution. There must be some other explanation for it. And there may be other dietary things that you need to do, which we don't yet know about, which could help you. So the problem is, if we put you on a statin, you'll think your cholesterol will come down, and you'll say, well, okay, now I'm fine, but I'm not convinced that that's the case. I think it's much more complex than that. And so I'm not saying you shouldn't go on a statin. What I'm saying is that even if you go on a statin, you must look at all the other possibilities. And you've got a lifetime's work ahead. As I said, I've got type 2 diabetes. It's fantastic because now my job is to find out how to manage this condition. It's exactly the same for you. You're so far ahead of medicine. We don't know how to manage it. Dr. Ken, by the way, is just a wonderful guy, one of my favorite doctors in Melbourne. And he's a fabulous guy. And if you were ever able to contact him, he would be able to help you, because he's dedicated to a low-carb diet. And if a low-carb diet doesn't work in this condition, he'll tell you, and he will help you find better ways of treating your condition. So this is not the end of the story for you. You need to find out how you cure your fatty liver, because the fatty liver will be the cause of all the other problems. And you've got to find the nutrition, the diet that will prevent that. Maybe it's a vegetarian diet. I mean, I don't know. But if I was you, that's probably the way I'd go. I'd probably cut right down on the fat and eat much more protein and vegetables and little carbohydrate, but not as much fat. And maybe I would stop eating saturated fat, and I'd see a way to go. But the answer is, I don't think the Banting diet's right for you. But what component of the Banting diet's wrong, I don't know. And I think that I would move to a more vegetarian, plant-based diet and see if that can't help. But the key is your fatty liver and those measures of the fatty liver. You've got to sort out the fatty liver and find out what's causing it, and the rest will follow.
Thanks very much for your question, Colin. I like seeing, Prof defending, and we like being challenged over here.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
That's great. Just Prof mentioned cutting back on saturated fats. We do have a few loads. We do have a few meal plans in the Beginner Banting online program that are low in saturated fats. So if you cut out saturated fats, but you still wanted to be sort of LCHF, that would mean making more use of monounsaturated fats, which you can find in your avocado oils and your nut oils, but still staying away from those seed oils. And then to have a look at the meal plan and the article that came with it, you can find it.
Can I just butt in there? You know, I'm just writing a paper with some colleagues we did about 8 years ago, on high-fat diets and performance, and there was clear two populations. There's a population that benefits hugely in the exercise performance on a high-fat diet, and there's another population who don't. And I think you are that population who don't benefit from this diet. And we know, I mean, go onto the internet and you'll see Dr. Greger and a couple other people claiming, and Dr. Ornish claiming that this diet's amazing. The plant-based vegetarian type diet is incredibly successful. And they will have individuals who've had huge success on those diets. And maybe you're that person who's going to benefit from doing exactly the opposite to what we prescribe. And you have to go and try and find it. So remember what you did. You went from a dreadful diet to a really good diet, but it didn't help. But why not just try that dreadful diet, change it for a diet that's not the same as our diet, but is still really good foods, but is more plant-based, and see what happens. And it'd be fantastic to hear from you to see what happens.
Yeah, please email us. You can contact either through the noakesfoundation.org or through realmealrevolution.com. We'd love to hear, the future of this story. On that note, we've come to the end of our questions for the day. If you want to find out more about the Noakes Foundation, the research they're doing and the projects they're running, please go check out the site. That's thenoakesfoundation.org. And again, if you'd like to get in touch with one of our banting coaches who could help guide you through our program, please visit realmealrevolution.com, click on find a coach, plug in your area, and hopefully there'll be a coach in your area. Otherwise, you can get online coaching. If you have a question, or you'd like to share a story with us, please email it into webcast@realmealrevolution.com, and hopefully Prof can answer your question next week. Apart from that, enjoy the rest of your week, have a great weekend, and thanks for watching.
Bye.
Bye.